So we'll read the first 12 verses of the chapter. We're going to see Paul before Festus today. And let's just read together. Chapter 25, verse 1. Now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul, and besought him and desired a favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, lying in wait in the way to kill him. Then Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea. And the next day, sitting in the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove, while he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. So we have here Paul standing in judgment under Festus. Of course, we're in this period of time between Paul's third journey and his journey to Rome. At the end of his third journey, he stopped by Jerusalem. On his third journey, he had collected money from churches all over Asia and Greece, churches that he had planted, and they had taken up offerings and sent men and the money with Paul back to the church at Jerusalem. And I believe he was headed up to Antioch after that, because that's the church that had sent him out. But in Jerusalem, the leaders there said, look, it's a busy time. He also wanted to be there at a busy time, at one of the feast times. So he's there, and they said, all these Jews from all over the world are coming here. They've heard what you've said. Let's just do this ritual, which Paul had done before. He had no qualms about doing certain Jewish rituals still. He was a Jew. Do this ritual, and then we can put to rest all these false charges against you, basically was the thought. And so after about 7 days, he was finishing up the different aspects of that ritual, and some Jews from Asia saw him in the temple, and they tried to lynch him. They grabbed him, they yelled, they shouted, there's a mob. He was being beaten up, and the Roman soldiers who overlooked the temple grounds saw what was happening, and finally they decided to go down and rescue him. They're dragging Paul out of the crowd, up the stairs. Paul requests to speak to the audience, and they let him. And the audience, all the mob gets very quiet, and he begins to testify to them. And he tells them all the different things that God had done in his life, how he'd grown up, what God had done for him. And then he told them, he was in the midst of that, telling them that God had told him to give the gospel, or give the truth, to the Gentiles. And as soon as he said the word Gentiles, the mob, erupted again. So then the next day, the captain in Jerusalem brings them before the Sanhedrin, basically, and they're arguing. The captain wants to beat Paul and get out of him why he's causing all this trouble, and Paul lets him know that he's a Roman citizen. But he's speaking before the Sanhedrin, and Paul kind of says, well, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and I'm being called in question because I believe in the resurrection. Well, Pharisees have always believed in the resurrection, and Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. And by saying that, he kind of got them fighting with one another. And even the Pharisees, for the moment, Paul was their buddy, and the Sadducees were like, he's a bum, and they're about to tear him apart, and the captain had to rescue him from that also. Then he finds out about a plot to kill Paul, and so the captain sends him under cover of darkness down to Caesarea, where he could be judged before Felix. Then all the Sanhedrin comes down to prosecute Paul before Felix, and they bring Tertullus, and they've got all their arguments lined up. And Felix postpones his judgment. They had all their arguments, but they couldn't prove them. They didn't have any corroborating witnesses. But Felix wouldn't dismiss the charges. He left Paul bound. And then he and his wife would listen a couple times to Paul. He continued to listen to Paul, but mostly so that he might get some money. He was hoping that he would get some money out of Paul and his friends. Felix was to the Jews, Felix was a bad ruler, if you want. He was a severe, harsh ruler, and the Jewish people did not like his reign, if you would call it, his rule. And he did many things very cruel to their people, which is kind of, when you know that, it's kind of interesting how Tertullus talked about how Felix was such a good ruler. There's just a blatant lie to try to flatter him, get him to rule in their favor. But anyway, the end of chapter 24 says, but after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, or into his office, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So about 2 years goes by, Paul is bound, and by that he's kind of under house arrest. He's bound, but he has a good amount of liberty in Caesarea. He's protected by the Roman government, but he has access to people, it seems, from other portions of Scripture there. But he can't just go wherever he wants to go. And so for about 2 years, he is in this situation. And then Festus comes, Porcius Festus comes and replaces Felix as the governor of the province. He's a new governor. So verse 1 says, now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. So he's a new governor. He needs to become apprised of what's going on in his province, and the place where most of the information is. I mean, he could sit in Caesarea, which is the Roman seat of government. Herod had built it as tremendous harbor and city and all of that, and that was where he would sit in judgment. It was the Roman seat of government in the province. But as far as the Jews are concerned, they didn't do much with Caesarea. That was a Gentile city, and their seat of government, where the Sanhedrin sat and all that, was in the temple, on the temple grounds in Jerusalem. So just after 3 days, I mean, I don't know how hard it was to sail, but he clearly came on a sailing ship, and he lands, and after 3 days, he goes up. He's got to figure out what's going on. I'm sure he heard some things while he was there in Caesarea, and probably even before, but he needed to find out what was going on. He was a good ruler, people would say, in a certain sense, he was a sensible ruler. He was somebody that believed that the Roman people and Roman justice and Roman system could work in Judea. As opposed, Felix was very harsh and cruel. The next two governors were worse. They were coming in just to crush opposition and all that. And finally, after the second one, or during the second one after Festus, is when the whole Roman army came in and surrounded Jerusalem and destroyed it. So Festus is actually what we might say is a sensible ruler. And he gets right to work. After 3 days, he goes up to Jerusalem. Caesarea was the Roman seat of rule, government for the province. And Jerusalem was the religious center and the local ruling center, if you might put it that way. The Jews, the Sanhedrin sat there, and they were allowed some government, and they had tremendous influence, and so they were sitting there in Jerusalem. And so he goes up there to Jerusalem to see what's going on. And when he gets there, verse 2, then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul. To me, that's very interesting. Well, first, the high priest is a new high priest. Historically, when we look at historical documents, this is not the high priest from 2 years before, Ananias. It's a different high priest. It's a new high priest. Felix had, among the different things they did, he took Ananias from his role as high priest and placed somebody else as high priest, which doesn't make sense to us if we've only read the Old Testament. But the Jews were people under bondage. They had an amount of liberty, but the Romans could tell the high priest when he could wear his garments, tell the Jews who their high priest would be and who it wouldn't be. But at the same time, Ananias still had tremendous power. I think 5 of his sons and his son-in-law had been high priests. And here this was Ishmael, I believe, is the name of the high priest here. Ananias is still around. He's still very powerful. Ishmael's not one of his sons, but Ananias is still there. But so they inform, in verse 2 it says, the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul. So Paul had been under house arrest, basically, for nearly 2 years. So he's there. He's got Roman soldiers with him all the time. Surely he had connections to the Roman government. We know that he did have connections to the Roman government when he was in this situation in Rome. He writes in letters how different whole parts of Caesar's household were believers and things like that. So Paul would have known that a new ruler came in, and I would think he would have had some opportunity to put a good word in for himself with Festus, but there's no word that he had done that. But the Jewish leaders seemed to bring Paul up as the first and most important topic. We don't know that for sure, but the narrative kind of reads like, so he goes up to Jerusalem, and the high priest inform him against Paul. Paul's been under house arrest for 2 years. I can hardly remember, something that happened a month ago or 2 months ago. But this is 2 years ago. Paul stood there, and they brought false charges against him, and they really kind of slandered the captain in Jerusalem, and Paul defends himself, and Felix just kind of pushes it off, lets it go. This is seething inside them. It's 2 years later, and the new ruler comes in. Okay, we got to take care of this Paul situation. They can't let it rest. And they can't even forget about it. Hatred runs deep, doesn't it? Malice, it runs deep. Bitterness, we might say, it runs deep. Paul had called the high priest a whited wall, and evidently you do that, you don't get forgotten. So I would also say, as much as I'm trying to say it's been 2 years, I think Paul's influence was still felt. He had some measure of liberty. And even though he couldn't leave Caesarea, I think he was probably writing. People were visiting him. He was strengthening those saints that would have visited him. He was sending encouragement to others. I think that perhaps he wasn't a quiet prisoner. And so it wasn't just the hatred from 2 years before. Perhaps when every month they would run into another person and they'd be talking to them, trying to whatever, prosecute them, and somehow the name of Paul would come up. Some issue would come up, and the name of Paul would come up. And so his activities, even as a prisoner, I think, kept them thinking about him. So what they do is they attempt to have Festus rule even before hearing the case. They inform Festus about Paul, and they besought him something, and it seems, okay, if we look at let's go back to the idea of Paul's influence still being felt. In the next chapter, when he speaks to Agrippa, in verse 22, he says, in verse 21, "For these causes the Jews caught me in the temple and went about to kill me. Having therefore obtained help of God, I continue unto this day, witnessing both to small and great, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses did say should come." So Paul says there, I was rescued, they were not allowed to kill me, and to this day, all I do is witness to small and great. That would be not powerful people, tremendously powerful people. I just witness of nothing other than that Christ died and rose again, as a paraphrase. So his influence is being felt, and they attempt to have Festus rule before the time, before even hearing the case. And they attempt to sway Festus's mind before the trial. I mean, they say, this guy, he needs to be judged, he should be killed. I know I wrote this verse down, yes. So in verse 15 and 16, later, after this incident that we're looking at today, he's talking to Herod Agrippa, in verse 15, he says, he's talking about this certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priest and elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him, to whom I answered, it's not a manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die. Okay, so they're informing him, saying, there's a guy in judgment in prison who's supposed to die. They want him to die, and they're trying to influence the judge to just kill him, to execute him. And he says, well, no, we don't just kill people, just because. Anyway, so they're attempting to sway Festus's mind before the trial, and and it seems like since he said, well, we can't do that, then we see the end of the verse, and besought him and desired a favor against him. So they desire a favor of Festus, but against Paul, and that is that he would send for him to Jerusalem. They said, well, let's just take care of this right now. Let's bring him up from Caesarea. We'll judge him. You'll see that he ought to die. Of course, the Bible tells what they were wanting to do, and that was that they would lay in wait along the way to kill him. They had done this before. They had tried to do this before. Apparently, they thought that they were less or more circumspect in their plans, and surely Festus had no idea that they would do that. I say that he had no idea. It seems he didn't have any idea, any suspicion of that. But they were definitely, the time before, there were some men that bonded together and told the chief priest that this is what they were going to do. Now it's the chief priest just doing it. And as it turns out, this is one of the big things that brought the Roman army into their land like 5 years later, is that there was bands of assassins that would just kill people. They would kill rulers, they'd kill important people, and that was some of the reasons why the Roman army came in. And so they were set for this, and that was their plan. They wanted to get Paul to Jerusalem and kill him along the way. And they assumed that this new ruler, Festus, only been here 3 days, 4 or 5 days, didn't really know of their hatred and their devious ways. But Paul, back in verse 4, but Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, verse 5, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. So Festus thinks otherwise. He says, why should I? Paul is already under Roman supervision. He's already in a jail there. And there's a lot of different reasons that we could surmise Festus thought. He may have thought, okay, maybe I don't know anything about this guy. Maybe he does deserve to die, but I want to establish myself as the Roman governor of this province. I'm going to sit in judgment in the Roman center of government. I'm not going to come here and let them have their way. He's a wise ruler. He's not a harsh ruler, but he doesn't. So perhaps he says, well, this may be true, but if I'm going to judge over it, it's going to look better. It's going to be better for Roman justice if I judge it in Caesarea. It may look like I'm a pawn of these Jewish people if I judge him here. That may be one of his thoughts. He may have thought it's just too much trouble. He may have thought, okay, it's 2 days trip down to Caesarea, and we get Paul, and the next day we come back, and by the time he comes back, then I have to set up a court. I have to sit in judgment, and it's for you. And I'm not planning to stay here that long. I don't want to prolong my visit here. I just want to find out what's going on and get myself back to Caesarea. It may have been that. It could be possible that he knew somewhat of the situation. There was the letter of Lysias that would have been on record in Caesarea, but that's unlikely. It's unlikely that he would have been able to go through all the history, all the things that Felix was leaving for him, and reviewed that before in just those 3 days' time. In fact, this was a minor case to the Romans. I mean, for Felix, he thought it might be a chance to get some money, but it wasn't an important thing. It was a religious thing. There's just this guy. It's not a big deal to him. So it could be that, but I don't think so. What we do know it is God's protection. It's God's providential protection. God knew, and the reason we know God knew is because Luke told us that that's what their plans were. God knew that their plans were to kill him along the way. And whatever reason God allowed Festus to decide not to bring Paul up, it was God that put it in his mind to do it. It was God's providential protection. God knows what's going on, and he allows what he will, and he does all these things for our own good. And it's amazing how he works all things out together. And we can't understand it many times when it happens. Even if we look back like this, we're looking in history, we can't explain exactly why Festus wouldn't do this. But we do know that above all of those human reasons that we might say are there, God was watching and ruling. Festus says in verse 5, he says, "Let them therefore which among you are able go down with me and accuse this man." Now, it might be that he was saying if they're financially able, meaning they can get out of their work responsibilities or something like that. Could be that. It could be if they're physically able. Maybe some of these people were aged and wouldn't be able to make that trip. But I think most likely what he most meant was that they're legally able. And that means, because he says, if you're able, where did it go? Those that are able and accuse the man. Okay? So if those that are able to accuse the man, come down. So what do you have to be able to do if you're going to accuse a person? You need to have proof, right? You need to have evidence. So to be able to accuse a person, you have to have evidence. That's probably fresh in our minds this week and the week before. I mean, how can you accuse somebody without evidence? It's a long-standing tradition. You know, the Jews tried it over and over again with Paul. So it's not a new thing to come against somebody with accusations and no evidence. But anyway, he says, if you're able, and I think that's what he meant because of the wordage, that's the verbiage, the words that are used later. And so then he says, and then he tarried with them more than 10 days. The words there that are translated that way kind of give us the idea of around 10 days, 8 to 10 days, maybe a little bit more. Not a long time. It wasn't like he was there for months. It was a short time. It fits in with him saying, I'm going to shortly go back there. So, and when he got back there, it says he went down to Caesarea, and the next day. So he gets back in Caesarea, and the very next day he says, I'm going to sit in judgment. He didn't sit in judgment every single day. He didn't have to judge cases all the time, but he wanted to take care of this right away. And another sign that he was an efficient and a sensible ruler. He says, I'm going to take care of this. I'm not going to have these troubles going on in my province under my rule. So he sits in judgment and he commands Paul to be brought up. He brings Paul up first thing. And when he was come, verse 7, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. So he said, if you're able to prove it, come down. They came down anyway, and they couldn't prove anything. The accusers there, we see they stood in a circle. This is probably not anything different than any other time. Festus would have been sitting at the judgment seat. The bema seat is the word. He's sitting at the judgment seat, and they would have been in front of him. Maybe but there was many of them. They're standing in a semicircle or something like that, and there's Paul, all of them against Paul, and they had many complaints and grievous charges, and they were the same things as before. Look at Paul's defense in verse 8, the next verse, he answered for himself, and this is what he answered. Neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. So their complaints were that he had broken their laws, and many of them, many complaints, grievous ones, and that he had defiled their temple, and we know that. That's what they said before also, and that he was subverting Caesar's rule. We could look at those charges in chapter 24, verse 5 and 6. Tertullus is here saying, for we have found this man a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also has gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. So and that's a summary. So those are the charges against him. And but the proof is none. They brought all these things which they could not prove. And that's the same as before. They were not, all the Jews assented that what Tertullus said was true. They all agreed, but there was no proof. Paul says, so he says in verse 19 of chapter 24, the people who claim this, who ought to have been here before thee and object if they had anything aught against me, or else let these same here say if they have found any evil doing in me, which while I stood before the council, except this one thing. So Paul, they had charges, but no proof when they came before Felix, and it's the same here. No one was able, they were unable, and I'm using that word on purpose because Festus said, ye that are able, they were unable to corroborate any charges against him. So then he answers for himself, verse 8, neither against the law, and I've said this, and that's Paul's denial and his defense, which is the same as before Felix, which we see in verses 11 through 21. Verse 11 through 21, and I was just quoting or reading some of that. We won't read all of that passage, but it's the same defense. He summarizes it here, basically exactly the same. I haven't done any of those things. He just denies it and says, and they can't prove it, and no one, because no one can prove it because I didn't do it. Then verse 9, but Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? So Festus tries to get in the good graces of the Jewish leaders. I don't think we should think of Festus as an evil person because of this. He's basically been there for 2 weeks. He's trying to maneuver a situation where the guy before him was very cruel. He wants the Jewish people to trust Roman justice, because Romans are very, in a certain sense, proud of their justice, that they don't punish people without cause or anything like that. So he wants the Jewish people to trust Roman justice. So he wants to do a favor for these Jewish leaders. And who is Paul? And now to us, Paul is a great man. But to Festus, here's this single guy in here who has these crazy charges brought up against him. And if it is so categorically untrue, why wouldn't he go to Jerusalem and do that? So I don't think we should, cast a lot of blame on Festus for proposing this. In one sense, it was a political gesture, and I think it was politically wise. Will you go up to Jerusalem? Now, what that meant was that, would you stand before the Sanhedrin? And I said, will you go up to Jerusalem and be judged of these things before me? Now, he would be judged by the Sanhedrin, and Felix would be there. So he asks, will you do this? Okay, he didn't command him to do it. He asked. He knew he was a Roman citizen, so he asked. And then he promises protection. He says, this is going to be before me. I'm going to be there. By saying that, he's saying nothing is going to get out of hand. Now, he didn't know, and we don't know, because Paul refused it. But this is what he was promising. So then said Paul, verse 10, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. So when he used the term Caesar's judgment, he wasn't saying that wasn't his request to stand before Caesar. He was saying, I'm standing in Caesar. Caesar would be the Roman system of justice. He says, I'm standing here now in the Roman system of judgment, and that's where I ought to stand. I ought to be judged in the standing system of judgment. I'm here already. He was there already. He did not want to stand under the Jews' judgment. Paul, and something to note as we pass by here is that Paul submitted himself to the secular system of laws and courts. Many times us independent Baptists and other Christians through history have kind of said, those secular rulers, they don't know this or whatever. Paul submitted himself to the secular system of courts and laws. He said, I stand in Caesar's judgment. He didn't say, I stand in God's judgment. Of course he did. He said that in other letters. But here he's saying, I'm right here. I'm standing in Caesar's judgment. And he says, I refuse not to die. So he's not saying I refuse to die. He says, if I've committed something worthy of death, and he's clearly intimating, and these people had, that they want him to die, they think he should die. He says, if I've done something worthy of death, I'm not afraid. I deserve to die. But these accusations are false, they're unprovable, and they call for my death, and you can't deliver me to them. I'm a Roman citizen. I have the right to appeal to Caesar, especially in this case, since they're calling for my death. And then he says, I appeal to Caesar. This was a common appeal in the 200s and 300s. It was less common in this time period, but Paul, as a citizen of Rome, could appeal. He had a right to be heard by the emperor. So then Festus, in verse 12, when he had conferred with the council, answered, hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar thou shalt go. The council is not the Jews that came down. The council is his counselors. He was sat in judgment with counselors that would advise him on certain aspects of law so that he would make a wise judgment. When he probably said, does this case warrant going to Caesar? Because Caesar didn't. You could appeal to Caesar, but you had to have a reason. So he couldn't just appeal for Caesar because he didn't like a judgment. So the counselor said, well, yes, this does match. It had to be a case where a man's life was in danger, or a person's life was in danger, and it was in this situation. So he says, so the council evidently says, yes, he can appeal to Caesar on certain grounds, and then, so he says, okay, you've appealed to Caesar, you will go and stand before Caesar. He gets himself out of a bind. There's another way he could have gotten out of the bind, and that would have been to just rule in Paul's favor. But that would have put him into a bind with the Jewish people. Okay? He knew that Paul, there was no proof against him. He could have just said, there's no proof here. He could free Paul, and the case would be closed. But this was a way for him to not have to anger the Jewish people that he wanted to rule. Paul gives them that opportunity by appealing to Caesar, and Paul's appeal to Caesar fit under the Roman rules and laws of that day. So he sent him. And as we find out next week, later he says, but I don't know what to tell Caesar he did. When he talks with Herod Agrippa, next week we'll talk at that. So mostly just kind of setting the stage here, a couple of things that we can remember and actually for ourselves apply them to our situation today. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for